Okay, here we go, folks. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another one of our TESS seminars. TESS stands for the Center for Tropical Environmental and Sustainability Science here at JCU, which is really probably one of our main centers for primarily terrestrial research. We don't get so much into marine stuff here. We do occasionally, but we just dip our toes. It's a real pleasure today to have Jeff Sayer. I wish we had Jeff and his collaborator Intu Bodhi Hartono here with us in person, but they're still doing a very admirable job. And Jeff, what time of day or night is it there where you are?
It's 11:05 at night, past my bedtime.
We're past Jeff's bedtime, so we will understand if things get a little fuzzy around the edges. We've got almost 20 people coming in online so far, and that'll almost certainly exceed that number. And then we've got a somewhat moderate audience here, but it will pick up. Jeff used to be based here at JCU. Many of you will know. Distinguished professor. Jeff and Intu subsequently left and went to the University of British Columbia. I think that's been one of the biggest losses that we've had at JCU, especially the JCU Cairns campus, since I've been here. Jeff and Intu brought an amazing breadth and depth of knowledge of international nature conservation. And it just was something that we needed here. And it seems like Jeff and Intu just knew everybody on the planet. I mean, they were so connected. And we really missed having their presence here with us. Just in terms of Jeff's background, he got his PhD at the University College London, very good institution. He worked primarily in Africa initially. Subsequently, he's worked a lot more in the Asia-Pacific region. Jeff has had many important positions. Among these are positions with IUCN, and also he was the founding director of CIFOR. And if you work in the environmental science space, you'll know about CIFOR. It's the Center for International Forestry Research, headquartered in Indonesia, but it's got centers all over the world. So a really big and important research organization that Jeff headed. But without further ado, we're going to hear from Jeff today on his views on conservation in Indonesia. I should point out that Jeff and I don't always agree, and I think that perhaps tells you that he must be pretty good if we're missing him that much, even though we're sort of used to butting heads and arguing from time to time. But without further ado, I'll turn things over to Jeff.
Well, thanks very much, Bill, and it's very nice to talk to you and see everybody. And I also wish very much that I was with you in Cairns today. I've got a little PowerPoint I'm going to show you in a minute, but I just wanted to say a few words to sort of situate myself in this whole thing. So I did do all this work with CIFOR and with IUCN in the past, and there came a point when I became a little bit dismayed by the proliferation of meetings and political posturing and stuff around this whole conservation thing, especially about forests. And I thought if only all those people would stop going to these huge meetings and spend a bit of time doing something on the ground, it would achieve more. So Intu and I decided then to leave IUCN and to take a few really important landscapes in the tropics and try and achieve something in them, try and make conservation happen in them. And we were fortunate that we got a big grant from the MacArthur Foundation to come and base ourselves at JCU to do that and to run a master's program, which was intended to build capacity in this region, Indonesia, in conservation, sustainable use. And I'm pleased to say that even today, there are people in really important positions, especially in Indonesia, but also in Bangladesh and Vietnam and Cambodia and other places, China, who came through that course that we ran at JCU. And we stay in touch with those people and we work with them regularly. So we did what we set out to do, and we chose some landscapes in Indonesia where we were going to really get to grips with them in the long term, build partnerships with local people, and try and understand the long-term changes that were taking place. Recently, I've been going back over a lot of this historical stuff and thinking back to my earlier days when I was involved with Indonesia, and I realized that we haven't done a very good job of predicting what was going to be important in Indonesia. So I started off, my involvement here was in the days when we were exploring the whole country, looking for potential protected areas, so the 70s and 80s. And that led to Indonesia having one of the best protected area networks, the best planned, using all Chris Margules' techniques and so forth. In theory, the best protected area networks in the world, covering 22% of the country. But after that, people sort of lost interest a bit in protected areas and moved on to other things. And I'm going to talk about some of those changes, but it leads me to wonder if we're very good at predicting what the next big driver of change in these landscapes is going to be. So after protected areas, we were very concerned about logging. People thought that logging was destroying the forest, even though it was very selective, taking out a tiny amount of timber. And lots of studies were done which showed that it really had few negative impacts on biodiversity and lots of good things about that logging. But as soon as the activists, we quietened them down on that one, they came up with the fact that as soon as you put in logging roads, people came in and practiced shifting agriculture, and then you got imperator grasslands all over the place. And there was this theory that the whole of Kalimantan and Sumatra would be covered in imperator grasslands, as was Laos and parts of mainland Southeast Asia. That also proved to be incorrect. After that, we got into other things that preoccupied donors, attracted all the money, but didn't really solve any problems. And in fact, the lead time for all these projects was so long that by the time they got operational, we'd realized that they were doing the wrong things. We actually led a study for the European Union in about 2004, I think, where we looked at all the projects of 55 donors. At that time, it was about $1.5 billion that had been spent. And, people had agreed that they'd never worked. Nothing had happened that was positive. So we did questionnaires of all the actors. And what we found was that people thought that what the foreigners were doing was not what the Indonesians wanted, even though they all signed these documents and agreed to do things. And that most of that money had been wasted. And I'm sorry to say that I think there's been a continuation of this waste of money being spent on conservation without really getting any good results. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those things now, but I think since you don't want to look at my face, you better look at some nice pictures. So I'm going to ask Intu to share my screen, and I'll... Okay, so... Is that good? So we came to JCU, and we spent 8 years in JCU, and it was fabulous. We lived up on the tablelands. We had a wonderful set of students and a wonderful set of colleagues, and we enjoyed drinking and arguing with people like Bill and lots of other people, and it was a highlight of our careers. And we really miss you all now very much. Well, almost all of you very much. The one or two people we don't miss quite so much, but Bill will tell you about that when you have a drink later on. But after 8 years, I have a cycle in my life. I always move on every 8 to 10 years. So we had this opportunity to come to UBC, so we moved here. And I have to just tell you a little bit about that because it's sort of quite a cool place, this. But nothing happens when I press the button. Annabelle, we're stuck. So we moved to this place, not particularly for the urban environment, but we moved to Vancouver because we had this opportunity to come to UBC, and we thought it was a pretty prestigious university, and it would be an interesting place to spend some time. And this is the university. It's almost as big as Cairns, I think. It's a huge place. It's really beautiful. When the sun shines, the sun almost never does shine. Most of the time it's raining. So when it doesn't rain, you have to run out and take a photograph. So this is where we spent the last few years. And it's got some pretty nice countryside behind it. So you'll see my pet wolf, who follows me everywhere. He gets his face in all the photographs, unfortunately, but he's dominated our lives since before COVID because he was the only company we had during COVID. So this is obviously the interior of British Columbia, Banff National Park. So we've traveled a lot here in this boreal environment, and it's really very interesting, very beautiful. And we go fishing and explore all these lakes and things. And we have a really nice house, not anywhere near as nice as the house we had up in Spiwa, but it's pretty good. And we've got lots of trees, and it's a funny old house, but we've got a big garden with lots of wildlife and lots of nice things to see. So we even have up here in the Arctic, we have hummingbirds that spend the whole winter here feeding on our bird feeders. And we have deer that come into the garden, and the dog thinks it's just a big dog and he plays with them. So it's quite nice in many ways. And yeah, when you go in the field, you sometimes see some wildlife. So we stumbled accidentally through the camera trap of one of our biologists one day. And about a month later, he sent us this image of myself and the dog, followed by Intu, followed by a grizzly bear, followed by a wolf, and then us coming back again about 2 hours later. So we didn't actually see those animals, but we were pretty close to them. So there's some exciting things here. It's a nice place to explore. So yeah, I started off by saying that all of these things that everybody thinks are the conservation problems in Indonesia, and we have to attack them and deal with them. And they attract huge commitments of funding, most of which get spent internationally at meetings and in flying backwards and forwards to different countries. And so artificial intelligence is asking me to do something, but I'll ignore that. I just want to list some, this is a long list potentially, just a few things that I thought we might talk about later on that have really changed since I first became involved in Indonesia. So there was this obsession with protected areas, with identifying them, gazetting them, getting management set up. That occupied everybody's attention in the 70s and most of the 80s. And the World Parks Congress was held here in 1983. And a lot of the protected areas, the big important ones, were gazetted at that time and signed off on by President Suharto, but some of them dated way back to Dutch times. And there's been a continuation since then, new protected areas, but there isn't really much empty land left that's available, so that's tailing off. After that, we were obsessed with the fact that logging was considered by everybody to be unsustainable, destructive. People thought the forest was being clear felled. It wasn't true. The logging was 2 or 3 trees per hectare on a 50 or 60-year cycle, which means a fraction of a cubic meter per hectare per year. Nowadays, we're getting 50 or 60 cubic meters per hectare per year from plantations. So we got over the logging bit after a time. But shifting agriculture was seen as a huge problem then. And there were projections that the whole of Kalimantan and Sumatra would be converted to imperata grasslands. And that didn't happen because the shifting farmers, they knew how to manage the landscapes, and they managed them in ways that resulted in forest coming back. I'll return to that in a bit, but basically Swidden agriculturalists here have always encouraged desirable species in their Swiddens and planted desirable species, and that tendency has increased over the years. So what we're getting is not forests converted to grasslands, but forests getting converted to species-rich agroforests, which produce a lot of stuff for society. And there are actually very few old-growth natural forests left in the lowlands of Indonesia. They're mostly in the mountains. Then in the beginning of the 21st century, we got all this interest in payments for environmental services and REDD+, and everybody stopped everything else while they waited for this huge amount of money that was going to flow to them from these projects for REDD+. And that's almost 20 years ago. The ideas were launched at a climate change conference of the parties in Bali in about 2006, and then signed off on in Copenhagen in 2009. And we're still really waiting for good examples. And as you're probably all aware, today it was announced that one of the biggest REDD projects in the world has now been accused of malpractice and is being, I think, attacked by the government. Is unhappy with it, and we'll see what happens about that. But several others in Indonesia are under inquiry. So there's a little hiccup on the road to REDD, which was what everybody seemed to be thinking was going to be the way forward. But carbon markets in general have got everybody very excited. The present minister in Indonesia was very resistant to them for a long time, but she's now suddenly got quite excited about them as she gets to the end of her mandate as minister. So we probably she'll re-emerge as something in the carbon market business in the future. But there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm very uncertain about it, but that's what everybody talks about at the moment. But there's some other things going on. So Indonesia has the fastest rural to urban migration of any country in East Asia. And people are predicting that maybe over 60, maybe as high as 68% of the population might be in cities by 2025, next year. That seems to me sort of improbable. I can hardly believe it, but that's what the databases say. So we'll see what happens. So this might mean that there's much less pressure on rural land, because at present, with 280 million people, the pressure for land everywhere is very high. So Indonesia, it looks enormous on the map. It stretches all the way up into Southeast Asia, but the land area is only slightly bigger than Queensland. So Queensland's 1.7 million square kilometers. Indonesia is 1.9 million square kilometers. Queensland has 5 million people. Indonesia's got 280 million people. So it's quite a different world. And then we have this Kunming-Montreal framework. And Stuart Pym talked to you about this a couple of weeks ago, and I saw a bit of his presentation, not all of it, because it was again in the middle of the night, but he touched on a whole lot of things that are of real concern to me, that these targets of just having more and more areas are unrealistic. You want to have areas in the best places that complement each other. Again, the work that our late friend Bob Pressier and Chris Margules did, and you want them managed well. And you don't want to confuse that with carbon sequestration, which requires different strategies. So there are big problems there, and I'm rather critical of this Kunming-Montreal framework, and some of the work we're doing at the moment is trying to build a body of evidence to say how unsatisfactory it is. Anyway, I'm going to go to these sentinel landscapes. So I'm not proposing or claiming to have an overview of everything that's happened in Indonesia. There are probably people in the room there in Cairns and online who know much more than I do about some parts of Indonesia. We decided to focus on these areas basically because they were areas where CIFOR was not working, and I didn't want to tread on the toes of my predecessors. So we had our prime site, which is in the Moluccas in Seram, which at that time hardly anybody went to, which is incredibly interesting. I mean, astronomical numbers of endemic birds, endangered birds, mammals on Sulawesi, 17 endemic endangered primates and so forth. Incredibly attractive place and interesting people as well, very diverse people. So we took students there during our time we were at Cairns, and we continue to do so from UBC now. The second one is in the center there, the center of red circle. That's North Kalimantan now. It's just been made a separate province. And the history of that does go back to CIFOR days. CIFOR had a research forest allocated to it by the Indonesian government, and I got to choose where it should be. So I chose a place that was very biodiverse, had a lot of diversity of people, and had not yet been logged, but was likely to be opened up for logging and other things in the future. So I thought it was really interesting to be able to follow that whole process and see how it unfolded. And the third place is the Sumatra Circle there, which is the Kampar Peninsula, Riau province, which is one of the fastest changing provinces in Indonesia, where there are huge peat swamp forests and where industrial timber plantations for making pulp and paper have been expanding, or did expand rapidly up until about 2003 or 4. And oil palm now covers a lot of the landscape. And the peatlands, of course, are quite special and very fragile. They can burn, and all sorts of things can go wrong with them. So there are some really serious losses of peatland ecosystems, but also some amazing gains that we've witnessed, and we've tried to influence these things. So we've become interested in behavioral ecology. We don't try and go in with a plan for these places. We try and get to know the people, build links with the local universities, get to know the local people and the local NGOs, and nudge them, as the behavioral economists say. We just sit at the table and suggest things and perhaps open their minds to other things, other ways forward, other things they might do. And I think we've been fairly successful in doing that. We have really good contact with people in all three of those areas and in other parts of Indonesia. And part of that is because people who studied with us at JCU are now back in those places, working in the field and working at pretty senior levels in the government departments that are responsible for those places. Even today, we had footage from Ruang, the volcano that's just erupted off the northern tip of Sulawesi, which is one of the places we used to go with students from here. And an ex-PhD student from JCU is now head of the Red Cross for that part of Indonesia. And he sent us these amazing, dreadful photographs of villages we knew well, which are now completely destroyed. And the plume of sulfur gases now covers most of Southeast Asia. Quite amazing. So we have a lot of links with people, and we maintain those links. And we've actually set up a foundation in Indonesia called Tanah Air Beta, which means our land and water. And it's a sort of iconic thing for Indonesia. There's lots of songs about it that people sing. And that foundation is mainly composed of people who used to study with us in JCU and have more recently studied with us in UBC, plus other colleagues that many of you know, people like Yatna Supriyatna and others who are prominent conservationists in Indonesia. So the first one then is Seram, which I'll just say a couple of words about these, and then I'm going to hopefully finish talking soon so that some of you might have some questions to ask. But I'm really fond of this area. It's physically beautiful. You've got intact, relatively intact forests going from sea level to 3,000 meters. The national park Manusela is a couple of 100,000 hectares, and it's one of the more intact protected areas in Indonesia. And there's a lot of interesting things going on. And it's famous, of course, because it's the Spice Islands. It's where all the cloves and nutmeg and things came from, and there's lots of fruit. So that a lot of the accessible lowland forests have been enriched by people over hundreds of years with these valuable species. But it also has this astonishing level of endemism. So 1,683 endemic species in Malaysia. I think it's, in terms of diversity, it's up with the Andean slopes of the Amazon and Colombia and places like that. And the level of endangerment is much higher because these things are existing on small islands in small populations. So this is the Buano monarch that I've become quite fond of. There's about less than a couple of hundred of them left on a little tiny island called Buano. And we've been trying to organize ways you might conserve it. And of course, if this thing existed in North America, you could get millions of dollars and nobody would dare do anything that might endanger it. But persuading these people on the islands who are pretty poor people that this is a global priority is tough. They don't get it because it doesn't do anything for them, this bird. So that's something I'm writing about right now. And then, there's this huge interest in getting local people to take care of forest in Indonesia. And we question that. We want to know whether they're really going to do that because they might have higher priorities. So we're really sort of, in theory, keen on decentralized management, local management. We also recognize that these global values often don't have much real value to local people, so they don't want to forego development opportunities in order to conserve something that brings them no real benefits. So that's our first sentinel landscape. The second one is Riau, the peat swamp forest. And this is the biggest, I think this is probably the biggest pulp and paper refinery in the world. And it belongs to a group called April, who also now are building mills in Brazil and Spain and all over the place. And they're amongst the biggest people in the world making pulp and paper. And COVID was good for them because the stuff goes into packaging for Amazon and so forth. But also they make viscose clothing, which I think is a very positive thing. It's a very renewable source of clothing, much better than polyester. And they were under pressure from NGOs, and I've been trying to sort of nudge them in the direction of doing some good things. So we got them to stop using any natural forests. We got them to agree to this target that's now talked about by the Forest Stewardship Council and others, of having 50% of all their holdings protected as natural forests. They're at about 45% at the moment, and they have some of the best protected, best managed peat swamp forests in Indonesia, some of the only ones that are really well protected and well managed. And we've been interested in those islands of natural forests in the area and the people who live in them. We've had students from here going to study those people and what impacts they have on wildlife and so forth. And We've been looking at the governance arrangements for the whole area. And the third one is North Kalimantan. So again, this was an area where CIFOR worked. It was CIFOR's research forest. It was actually called, in my day, the Bulungan Research Forest. Bulungan now is the name of a special economic zone that's being set up to process all the nickel that's coming from all those islands up there, and they're going to make batteries and things. And of course, as you all know, they're moving the capital city to this area, the Ibu Kota Nusantara, which we thought might sort of go out of fashion and when the present president left, but it seems the new president is equally enthusiastic about the area. And one of the most powerful ministers, Luhut, has been made, or is going to be made, minister for this area. So it's right in the middle. Well, it doesn't quite coincide totally with the CIFOR research forest, but it's pretty close. And so what happens there is of great interest. It's pretty much inside what was once in the early 80s, the largest rainforest protected area in the world, the Kutai National Park, which has shrunk somewhat. It was about 3 million hectares then. It's about 200,000 hectares now. But there is, so James Langston also, who did his PhD at JCU and then worked with us as a postdoc, he's been there in the last week, and he says that there's some interesting environmental things going on around that new capital city. So this was why we went there, because we thought it might eventually get logged, and we were very concerned about the quality of the logging. So a lot of CIFOR's work was to do with reduced impact logging, and we saw the dangers there of being in bad logging. But then oil palm came along, and we began to see that as a possible danger, but we worked out that maybe if you did it right, it was not necessarily that bad. But what we never dreamed about was that it would become a big place for mining. This photograph is not actually in that area, but there is coal underlying the entire area where we had our research forest, and open-class coal mining is spreading all over the place, and it's bringing with it, of course, roads and migrants and so forth. All that coal is shipped in barges to other Asian countries to make electricity, basically. So that is, something we had never thought about and has been the biggest driver of change. We also thought that all the Dayaks living in the hinterland up in the hills who were practicing shifting agriculture would move down to the lowlands and move to the cities and get jobs in, I don't know, oil palm estates or forestry or whatever. But we're really pretty surprised now to discover that the younger people are going back there and asserting their rights to the land. And part of the reason is because there are roads now that have been put in by the mining companies, but also they feel ownership of that land, and they now have, this is one of the main villages from which they manage a huge area, but they feel that maybe by having some claims on ownership of that land, they might get some of these payments for RED or for environmental services of some sort. But the big thing that's happening there now is that hydroelectric dams are being built, 2 huge ones, which are going to provide electricity for the new capital city and for this special economic zone that's just north of the capital city. So again, all sorts of things are happening which we had never thought were possible. And these people are Punans, the hunter-gatherers that, everybody was very concerned about in the 70s and 80s, and people thought they were being badly treated in Malaysia, which they probably were. But they've come through pretty well. People have been to university. People running this village, which is the center of a huge district, they're all Punan. Well, not all, but mostly are Punan. So what I wanted to talk about with you, really, that's all sort of preamble, is what are the things that are really going to change in the future? What do we need to do to have a positive influence in Indonesia on forests? What role can researchers play, and what should we be encouraging our ex-students and future students to be looking at in Indonesia? So in that last area that I showed you, the research forest where CIFOR was operating, it was in East Kalimantan. In the 1990s, there were 520 active logging concessions there. Today, there are about 20. And I never dreamed that would happen, that people have just left because getting timber out of concessions was not attractive. Economically, you could make more money by investing in other things. But my friend Susanna Barrett, what's her name? I can never pronounce it. Burivalova, who works for University of Michigan now, I think, but was with conservation TNC, has looked at a lot of those concessions on imagery and found that the rate of deforestation in those abandoned concessions is much higher than in any other areas. So this sort of echoes the study that was done a long time ago by people from California that deforestation was much higher in protected areas in national parks and reserves than it was in the logging concessions. All these things are a little bit counterintuitive. And I don't really understand how this is happening because the plywood mills, many of them are still running. The ones in remote areas have closed down, but there are plenty of plywood mills operating in Java, and other timber is still being exported. So what has apparently happened is that you can now get timber much more easily from, well, obviously from industrial plantations, but also from farmers' plantations. So Java was almost totally deforested at the beginning of the last century. And now Java, which has over a half of Indonesia's huge population, is the only part of Indonesia where the forest area is growing. So there are more forests in Java now than there have been in the past. Farmers can make money by growing trees, and so they do. And so there are plywood mills and sawmills operating with the timber that's coming off farms. So we even have a little bit of land in Bali, and we grow some timber there. If you want to sell it, you can phone up somebody in Surabaya. They'll send around people with a truck. They'll cut down the trees. They'll pay you cash on the spot, and it all goes into a pulp mill or a sawmill. So this is a total change in the whole way the timber industry is operating. And it's hard to get data on how this is impacting on the amount that's exported, because a lot of it's consumed within the country and a lot's going to Southeast Asian countries. You see barges heading for Singapore in the night and things like this. But I also now have the feeling that much more of the timber is being processed, at least to a certain degree, domestically in smaller operations and packed into containers and shipped all over the world. And maybe when it's done like that on a small scale in containers, it doesn't attract the attention of the activists who are trying to prove that it violates some European Union rule. But it's a reality. But it then begs the question of, what is going to happen to all those areas that were logging concessions and now are not needed for that? Will they tend to become oil palm? Will they tend to be used for fiber plantations, or will they just be left because they're too remote? And that's a pretty large area of land. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about that. So Swidden agriculture, as I said at the beginning, was seen as this huge problem and was thought to be expanding rapidly as populations grew and as roads went to remote areas. But if you look at the government figures now, they seem to claim, and you can get figures in Ministry of Agriculture documents for every district in the country, how much shifting cultivation was taking place there in any year. There's no sign of it decreasing very much. My feeling is that it is decreasing, that people are moving out of these areas. And we have a doctoral student who's on the line tonight, Cynthia Awida, who's from Indonesia, who's with us here in UBC, looking at these issues of what's happening to that Swidden agriculture, what's happening to the people who are doing it. And she's looking at the role of out-migration by men and women, but also the role of women on the ground. And what, again, seems to be happening is that people don't just burn their Swidden and destroy it totally and farm it for 1 or 2 years and then move on. Nowadays, they're leaving more trees and they're planting more trees. And in some areas, they're planting oil palm. Not much, but just enough to give them a bit of income. And if they're close to a river, they can take the oil palm branches down the river to a pulp mill, palm oil mill. So I think Swidden agriculture is going to disappear. And Cynthia, our student, might disagree with me, but it seems to me that it's likely to do so. The other big problem is that Indonesia is a huge country with a huge population that's still growing, and it's not yet self-sufficient for agriculture, food. It's still importing rice, which is, again, amazing. And I think it's because of bad Suharto era policies, which really didn't favor the producer. They favored the urban consumer of all this rice. And they have created a situation where the incentives for farmers to use modern practices are not there. It's a bit like the situation in India with government interference in India, lack of interference in rice or cereal growing. In Indonesia, there's been too much interference and it's not working. But the new incoming president, Prabowo, has a history of being very keen on these industrial agricultural projects, this sort of mega scale industrial agriculture things. And he's got one in central Kalimantan and peat swamp forests, and he's involved in some way in similar things in Papua. I mean, he may not be involved himself, but he definitely believes this is the way forward and is encouraging those sorts of things. And this worries me because I think the farmers, given the right incentives, are perfectly capable of meeting Indonesia's food needs. And the track record of industrial large-scale agriculture, especially on these very poor soils and poor inappropriate soils, is not very good. So that, for me, is one of the problems we should be looking at in the future. Carbon markets, again, this is what everybody seems to be counting on at present. I'm afraid I'm really skeptical. I always have been, because there's so much uncertainty about who owns the land, who incurs the cost if you don't log a forest, how do you measure these things? And you do this in a place where the cadastral surveys are not very good, land rights are not very clear. So most people are placing their faith in carbon markets, making rural people rich and saving forests, but I would hate to give too much reliance to that. There is this rural-urban migration, which is really amazing, that there are projections that say as much as 68% of the population might be in cities by 2025. That's next year. I find those hard to believe, but certainly the rate of migration to urban areas is very high. And what we're seeing in the areas where Shintia and Intu have been working is that although whole families don't pick up their roots and move, they send one or two of their children who remit money to them, and the older generations stay out there in the forest and try and maintain a bit of swidden agriculture. But they are, obviously not going to be there forever, those old people. And so there is this staged migration to urban areas that's having a big impact on what's possible in Indonesia. So if you were optimistic, you might imagine that there would be a lot less pressure on rural land in the future, and that we might have more opportunities for conservation. And the last thing is this Kunming-Montreal framework. So it's occupying a lot of my time right now. So we've set up to have 30% of the world conserved, and we've got all these ideas like other effective conservation measures. And I think, as with Stuart Pym, I'm very skeptical about this. We don't need more areas. We need better areas, better located, better monitored, so we know what's going on, and better managed. And these other effective conservation measures, which countries may sort of use to meet their 30% target, they're going to be very difficult to do in many countries, and there's a lot of potential problems with them. So I'm going to stop there because I didn't really mean to talk this long anyway. I was hoping that some of you might have some views and that somebody might disagree with me on some of these things. And I'll disconnect and stop sharing, and thank you for giving me your attention. And midnight is approaching, so back to you, Bill. Oh. And I see that Beck has arrived. I didn't introduce Beck, but she did her PhD with us in Cairns and is now back at CSIRO in Canberra. Welcome back. Have we lost Bill? I can't see him anywhere. Oh, you're
Jeff, it's Dennis Walls here. I just wanted to ask you a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Jeff, you were a little critical, it seemed to me. Maybe I'm misreading the way you were phrasing it, but about you kept saying activists, and there was a sort of tone as if it was slightly disparaging. I just wondered if you could flesh that out for me. Are you critical of some of the stature or the approach that activists take in that space, or am I misreading the way you were recounting it?
Yeah, I'm fairly critical of activists in the sense that, I refer to these issue cycles. So it's just necessary that one activist group decides that, say, oil palm is evil or logging is bad or something else is bad. And then they all run after that like a pack of hounds. And I think there's not very much thoughtfulness, not many people sitting back and looking at these longer term changes, really trying to understand what sort of changes are likely to fly in Indonesian society. Because if you take positions that are likely to be opposed by a large proportion of Indonesians, which some external activists do, then you're just going to irritate people probably and not succeed. So I do find it troubling that there are people who now sit in, I don't know, California, New York, south of France and other places and throw stones at Indonesia, but are not very deeply involved in what's happening in Indonesia. There are some really good activists in Indonesia who do engage with the processes, and I'm totally supportive of them. And I suppose in a sense, I don't like to be thought of as an activist, but I mean, I do have views on what should happen, and I try and do things that might make those things more likely to happen. But I think, yeah, I think the performance of a lot of the conservation NGOs in Indonesia is less impressive than it might be, because their only potential source of money is carbon markets. So they're all very keen on that, and most of their staff sit in Jakarta and they don't spend much time in the field. That's not true of everybody. There are some who have some really good field people, and we're very supportive of them. But the world of conservation in Indonesia is a little bit sort of dispersed and disconnected and running after whichever is the latest fashion.
Can I just interject there? Annabelle has said she's locked out of the theatres. Can someone in the theatre let her in if that's the case? Thanks.
Yeah, maybe Bill is locked out as well.
Possibly.
So there's somebody called Lilian Chua who has raised her hand. Maybe she could ask a question.
Hi, Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the enlightening talk. I have two questions here. I'm from Malaysia. And there is lately, in the last few decades or so, the issue about logging concessions versus plantations. Now, I think you know that Malaysia practices sustainable forest management. So we do have our forest management plans, etc., harvesting plans and stuff. But what do you think about this propensity of turning concession areas, which are badly logged, into plantations? In this case, it's timber plantations here, not oil palm plantation. Yeah. That is question one. Question two about this. Lately, there has been a lot of mining licenses and mining areas popping up. Though they are very small, per project they are quite small. The size is quite small, but when you take them in totality, they actually fragment whatever natural forest that is remaining. So what are your ideas about how could we mitigate this, or how could we prevent what we call mining as becoming another huge driver of threat? Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. So really interesting question. So I personally think that those sustainably managed natural forests producing quite a small yield of timber were an excellent way to use that forest land, and they maintained most of the native biodiversity. They created jobs in remote areas, and they were a pretty good land use. So the idea that they would be converted into monoculture plantations is a little bit distressing. You're getting into this debate about whether you wanted integrated land use, so where biodiversity conservation is integrated into other land uses, or whether you want to get segregated landscapes. And I think all the economic drivers are pushing us in the direction of these segregated landscapes. I mean, under the Malaysian uniform system, you were ending up with pretty pure stands of a few species of dipterocarps anyway. They look pretty much like plantations in some places. But in Indonesia, that didn't happen. The Indonesian selection system left you with a very rich mixed forest, and all the biodiversity did pretty well. So I think what you suggest might happen is probably what will happen. I mean, we're already predicting that 50% of the world's timber will come from plantations by about now, I think. Because and I do think the world should use a lot of timber, because if the alternative is coal or oil or whatever, then surely we should use timber. So I'm very keen on that. I just hope it gets done in a way that leaves us with decent areas of natural forests. The mining thing is much more tricky. I've got students now working on this in the Congo Basin and in Indonesia. And we have a couple of new Chinese students who are going to work on this because we think we want to influence Chinese policy. And we have an ex-JCU PhD student who worked on this in Africa, who's now, well, she was back in China, running a little institute looking at the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative, which was driven a lot by the need to get access to mineral resources. She's actually leaving next month and going to the School of African and Oriental Studies in London. And I'll be meeting her there quite soon. But yeah, we're really concerned about the fact that mining is expanding so rapidly. And of course, as you said, the mine itself doesn't necessarily take up much space, but some of it does. So the coal mines in Kalimantan take up a huge amount of space. And it seems that the nickel mines in Sulawesi and the Moluccas are also, there's a lot of open cast mining, and it's spread around, so it results in lots of roads and lots of movements of populations. And Morowali Wildlife Sanctuary, I think it is. It's called a national park in some documents. That's one of the biggest and most important protected areas in Sulawesi, and it's got a nickel mine complex right in the middle of it. So there's a lot of land use change that's going to be driven by this, for sure. So the whole transitional metals thing is a big deal. And Rebecca Riggs, who's joined us now from Canberra, is working on this and still collaborating with our lab on that problem. So there are lots of issues about how you make decisions about mining and so forth, and how you're not going to stop it, I don't think, how you steer it in the direction of producing landscapes that meet the needs of local people and meet environmental goals better than they might otherwise do. But it's a huge issue. So if I can be chairman, I can invite Fiona Ryan to speak.
Okay. All right, Fiona, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I'm going to be a bit vulgar and talk about money. It's a developing country, Indonesia. And I think with the carbon markets, they're really not going to work at the project level. It's too easy to manipulate baselines, etc. But I think, and just to see what RED has been to this moment in Indonesia, I mean, the Green Climate Fund did the RED program, I think a few years ago. They gave Indonesia about $100 million US. And in their project documents, the Indonesian government, it was a national program, so all across the multiple provinces of Indonesia, they said there were 9 million households, forest-involved households in Indonesia. So that makes about $10 a household. And I don't really see how that could have a really big effect on people's incentives to preserve forests or not preserve forests. I mean, especially if you're going to do it at the local level, you've got to get a community forestry expert and a social expert and a gender expert to go off to a village far off in the jungle and, you know, and pay them what, $10 between them. I don't think it's really, you know, Red hasn't delivered the money. The West wasn't, the donor countries just haven't delivered the money. And I don't think the voluntary carbon market is. It's going to have to come through the, you know, the EU ETS hit about €100 last year a tonne. So there is the money there. It is possible. It's gone down since because there's things happening in Europe, you know, with energy and stuff. But yeah, but it's still around about €50 a tonne. So I'm just saying, you know, if you're going to provide different incentives to local people, I think it's really important that you actually pay the full amount and not you know, $10 a household. It's not going to really change people's attitudes so much to their land use.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I've right from the beginning been very skeptical about these things working in countries where, as I said before, cadastral systems are very weak and nobody knows who owns the land and nobody can really say what the alternative uses of the land might have been. And so hardly any of this money has ever got to those people on the ground. And all these pledges of huge amounts of money have, well, if they've materialized, it's just been to organize more conferences and I don't know. So I'm very skeptical, but these things work really well in, say, Australia or New Zealand or in Europe to some extent. So it is possible for these things to work. And maybe we have to get these countries to, or hope these countries will be able to organize themselves to make things work. So in Indonesia now, they seem to be getting very cool on voluntary markets, but they want to have a national system, which I think is what you think is better. But I still think we're a long way from the day when people in, you know, my cousin in New Zealand gets a check twice a year for a lot of money because she's protecting forests on her land. The day that we get to that situation in rural Indonesia, I think is still quite a long way into the future. So whether we have to sort of tough it out and make that eventually happen or rely on it happening, or whether it's a little bit futile, I don't know. It is distressing that huge amounts of money are made available, but the money gets captured by the big international organizations and by rich people, not by, it doesn't get into the pockets of the poor people. So I just agree with you.
Okay. Any questions here just one second, Jeff?
Thanks very much for such an amazing, informative talk, Jeff. My name's Carolyn Ems. Look, I'm interested in the carbon capture. Look, you just mentioned it might work in Australia or New Zealand. I guess you mean they're more wealthy countries, but we are having problems in Australia with a huge onslaught of renewable energy projects, and we're just finding, I'm just wondering if you're aware of what's going, or if you have an opinion, or are you having similar problems in Indonesia with rare earths mining, the land, in other words, the land use changes for renewable energy appears to be much greater than, say, the problems they had with logging. I agree with you with logging, but this is what we're observing, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but we're looking at the Great Dividing Range, which has always been off limits to agriculture, off limits to inaccessibility. Now we're looking at 4,300 kilometres of haulage roads. I'm just wondering if you're aware of it, or if you've heard of it, and what's happening in overseas with these issues. Yeah, it's a real problem here anyway.
Well, it's a real problem here in British Columbia too. And a huge amount of polarization of views of everybody, on political parties, NGOs, environmentalists, and everybody else on what should and should not happen. So I don't follow that closely, and especially not in Australia. But Rebecca Riggs, who did her PhD at JCU, is online, and maybe she should comment on that.
Hi,
Yes.
Jeff.
Hi, Rebecca. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to comment. I don't think I could. My head is in critical minerals and energy transition minerals. So, yes.
So it is a big thing in Indonesia because some of these minerals, well, nickel is very abundant. I think Indonesia has 80% of the known global reserves of nickel, and people are furiously mining it and smelting it and doing deals with Elon Musk to make electric cars in Indonesia. I don't think Indonesia is so strong on the other minerals, but it may be. I just don't know that. But when we got the power stations, the electric power that's needed to run all these smelting plants and so forth, which are emerging as a big issue in rural areas, in the areas. So we're pretty interested in some of the more isolated populations in remoter parts of Indonesia. We're concerned about their livelihoods, and we try and keep in contact with some of them and see what's going on and see if we can help them to get good deals. And they're being impacted by both the mining and the hydroelectric dams. So this whole, move away from fossil fuels to other things is not simple. It's got lots of, it's got its own set of risks which are quite significant. So
take your point on the nickel. Oh, sorry, Jeff. Take your point on the nickel. I read recently that there's something, just a typical car battery has something like 60 pounds of nickel in it. I mean, that's just incredible, the demand that must be creating right now. Hey, Jeff, I just wanted to ask you, maybe just as a final question, about what used to be called Irian Jaya, the Indonesian part of New Guinea. That would obviously be one of the most still forested areas, but it's not coming under a lot of development pressure now. Just wondering what your thoughts are about that area and how you see it developing maybe in the next 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, that's also a really, really interesting question, because people are taking their positions on it and battling it out. It's still incredibly sparsely populated, and it's incredibly rich and interesting. And that would have been one of our sentinel landscapes, but it was just so expensive to go there, and it's difficult to work there. You really need to live there to do anything. We've got an ex-PhD student from JCU who's in the university in Manokwari, who I communicate with all the time. He's doing good work. So people are trying to prevent palm oil coming into Irian Jaya, but I think that you need to move the population of, Irian Jaya, that's a slip of the tongue, of West Papua. I think you need to get some of those people into more settled employment in things in the cash economy at a reasonable level, because otherwise the population just keeps growing and destructive land use practices keep spreading. So I'm not opposed to more development in Papua. Obviously, I hope it's sustainable and well managed, and that's a challenge. And Papua now has this semi-autonomous status in Indonesia, so the money from the huge copper mine goes back into the province and seems to get spent reasonably well. So I think it's going to go through some difficult times over the next 10 or 20 years. And I just hope that some of the lessons that have been learned in other parts of the tropics can be translated and applied there, and that we can see a sensible evolution of development. So some of the big companies in Western Indonesia now are bidding for these conservation concessions, restoration concessions there. And I think that's because they expect to be able to get money for the carbon at some time in the future, which is not the reason I favor it. But I think if they have an ability to manage land, which some of them do, and to protect it, then that's not a bad thing. I'm not opposed to the arrival of some of the bigger corporations dealing with both forests and the oil palm within region, because you can actually influence what the corporations do much better than you can influence what local government does. But the danger is food estate. The food estates that Prabowo is really keen on, that is a bit frightening. So I don't think they work. And Chris Margules knows all about that. But they seem...
Sorry, Jeff. Is transmigration from Java and Sulawesi still happening or is that
not transmigration, but people move. It's not so much from Java. The Javanese like to stay at home, but there's a lot of people coming from the Bugis and the Bhutanese. So there's a lot of movement of people. Anywhere in Indonesia where there are jobs, word gets around, they've all got cell phones, they flock in to get those jobs. And the Papuans, of course, tend to be less disciplined and willing to take regular paid employment, so they lose out sometimes. But the formal transmigration program, it still exists in theory, but it's not very active.
All right. Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and bring things to a close here, Jeff and Intu. Thank you very much. We hugely appreciate you guys sharing your experience and knowledge with us and perspectives. There were various points along the way. I felt like we could have had an interesting debate, but probably not the right time and place. But wonderful to hear your perspectives, and thank you very much for coming to us from such a long ways away. So thank you, Jeff and Intu.
Thanks for inviting us, and we'd love to come down and spend a bit of time in person arguing with you all.